What makes a weapon deadly? The steel? The scope? Or the man behind the trigger? In January 1943, one soldier brought his personal hunting rifle to war, a weapon his commanders mocked as a toy. 4 days later, he'd eliminated 11 enemy marksmen and rewritten military doctrine. This is how a catalog-purchased sporting gun proved every expert wrong about modern combat. January 22, 1943, 9:17 in the morning. Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside a shattered enemy bunker west of Point Cruz. Peering through optics his fellow officers had ridiculed for 6 weeks. 27 years old. Illinois state champion marksman. 0 confirmed enemy kills. Enemy sharpshooters operated in the Point Cruz palm groves. 11 of them, and during the previous 72 hours, they'd eliminated 14 soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had dismissed his firearm as worthless. The other platoon commanders nicknamed it his catalog sweetheart. When he'd unwrapped the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan optic and Griffin and Howe mounting system at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the weapons specialist questioned whether this was intended for deer or Germans. George clarified it was meant for Japanese forces. They deployed before the firearm arrived. George spent the ocean voyage observing other soldiers maintain their Garands, while his personal weapon remained in an Illinois warehouse. He requested it be forwarded via military postal service. 6 weeks afterward, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant delivered him a wooden container marked fragile. Inside rested the firearm he'd saved 2 years of National Guard salary to purchase. The weapon weighed 9 pounds. The optic added another 12 ounces. The Garand distributed to every other soldier in his battalion weighed 9.5 pounds without magnification. George's firearm was bolt-operated, 5 rounds capacity. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds capacity. Captain Morris commanded him to abandon the sporting weapon in his quarters and bear proper military equipment. George carried it regardless. The 132nd Infantry had relieved Marine forces on Guadalcanal in late December, 1942. The Marines had been engaging since August. They'd captured Henderson Field. They'd defended it. But they hadn't captured Mount Austin, and they hadn't eliminated enemy forces from the coastal palm groves west of the Matanika River. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet in elevation. Enemy forces called it the Gifu, 500 soldiers, 47 fortified positions. George's battalion assaulted on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. They suffered 34 killed and 279 wounded before finally capturing the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had discharged his Winchester precisely 0 times in engagement. The vegetation around Point Cruz differed completely. No fortifications, no established positions. Just enemy soldiers who'd retreated west from Henderson Field and established themselves in the massive trees. Some of those soldiers were sharpshooters. They possessed scoped Arisaka Type 98s. They understood the terrain. They understood how to wait. On January 19th, a marksman eliminated Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a stream. On January 20th, another marksman eliminated 2 soldiers from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 additional soldiers perished. One received a shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice. The battalion commander summoned George that evening. The enemy sharpshooters were eliminating his soldiers faster than malaria. He required someone capable of accurate shooting. He questioned whether that catalog firearm could actually strike anything. George explained his qualifications. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939, 23 years old at the time. Youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groupings at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander granted him until morning to demonstrate it. If you want to discover how George's civilian firearm performed against enemy sharpshooters trained for tropical warfare, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to George. George spent the night inspecting his weapon. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again. He inspected the scope mountings. He loaded 5 rounds of .3006 hunting ammunition he'd packed in Tennessee, military ball ammunition. The identical cartridge the Garand discharged. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position inside the ruins of an enemy bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence indicated the enemy sharpshooters operated from the large trees in that area, banyan trees. Some reached 90 feet in elevation, with trunks 8 feet in diameter. A marksman could ascend one of those trees before dawn and remain there all day without detection. George had brought no spotter, no radio operator, just his weapon and a canteen and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began observing the trees through his optic. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not substantial, but sufficient to detect movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The vegetation was never silent. Birds, insects, the distant sound of artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17, he detected it. A branch moved. No wind, just a small shift, 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards distant. George observed. The branch moved again. Then he detected the shape of a man, dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The enemy sharpshooter was facing east, observing the trail where George's battalion had been transporting supplies. George adjusted his optic. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would discover if a civilian target weapon could eliminate a soldier trained to eliminate him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the vegetation. 240 yards distant, the enemy sharpshooter jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches. His body tumbled 90 feet and struck the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He kept his optic on the tree, waited for movement. Nothing. The marksman's partner would be close. Enemy sharpshooters worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just eliminated the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the trees nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The optic's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could conceal multiple soldiers. The vegetation canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second marksman. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The enemy soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot and understood his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, discharged. The second marksman fell backwards off the tree. His weapon clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both struck the vegetation floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 eliminations. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, an enemy bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 sharpshooters. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was basic marksman doctrine: shoot and relocate. But in vegetation this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 1138 3rd Tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The enemy sharpshooter had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and discharged. The 3rd marksman fell without making a sound. By noon, George had eliminated 5 enemy sharpshooters. Word spread through the battalion. Soldiers who had mocked his catalog weapon now asked if they could observe him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The enemy sharpshooters adapted after the 5th elimination. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and detecting nothing. At 16 o'clock hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the vegetation floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for operations. George spotted the first marksman of the day at 9:12. The enemy soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. This marksman had chosen a tree 290 yards out longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and discharged. The marksman fell. The 6th elimination brought a response George hadn't anticipated. At 9:57, enemy mortar began striking the area around his bunker. They'd triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would strike the bunker. George grabbed his weapon and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater as the third salvo struck. The bunker he'd occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a different position. A fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his observation. The enemy sent more sharpshooters that afternoon. They understood George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 14:23, George eliminated his 7th marksman. At 15:41, he eliminated his 8th. This one had climbed high 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment, but the elevation created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 17 o'clock hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George provided them. 8 enemy sharpshooters eliminated over 2 days. 12 rounds discharged against the marksman. 8 strikes, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue marksman operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 enemy sharpshooters operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now eliminated, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who'd survived the longest. And now they understood exactly what George looked like and exactly what weapon he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 o'clock, he gave up and sat in his tent with the weapon across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree. Somewhere the enemy wouldn't expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks, the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found marksman number 9. The enemy soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most sharpshooters climbed high for better sightlines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle granted him a view down into the fronds. He could detect the dark shape of the marksman's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting sharpshooters for 3 days. He'd eliminated 8 soldiers. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them unless it was bait. George lowered his weapon and scanned the surrounding trees. If the marksman in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The enemy sharpshooter was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real marksman was observing the wrong location. If George discharged at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The marksman would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the marksman would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy marksman in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, discharged. The decoy marksman jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his weapon toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real marksman would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George detected it a slight shift. The marksman was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and discharged before the marksman could fully turn. The real marksman fell. His weapon tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 eliminations. But George had revealed his position to anyone else observing. He grabbed his weapon and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, enemy machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed eliminations, 1 remaining. The 11th marksman would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd observed 10 of his comrades perish over 3 days. He understood George's tactics. He understood George's weapon. He understood George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was observing, waiting, planning. George scanned the vegetation through his optic. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible but not identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch or a soldier. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th marksman wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George detected the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The enemy marksman was using the vegetation floor cover ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching marksman. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The enemy marksman stopped moving at 9:52. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George observed through his optic. The marksman was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of marksman operations, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment, rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the enemy marksman began moving again. He crawled forward 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The enemy marksman had observed the machine gun attack. He understood George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the enemy marksman reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The marksman was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot even without an optic, but George hesitated. This marksman had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He'd outlived 10 other sharpshooter soldiers who'd been eliminated because they made mistakes. This soldier wouldn't make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced marksman would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George kept his optic on the marksman in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it a second enemy soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, not repositioning, just observing, waiting. His weapon was aimed toward the drainage ditch, where George should have been hiding. 2 soldiers, not one. The 11th marksman had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 sharpshooters numbers 10 and 11 working together. George made his decision. He couldn't shoot both soldiers before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That granted them time to locate him and return fire. He required a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the enemy soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes observing the drainage ditch and detected nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both soldiers began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 enemy soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George discharged. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the weapon toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The soldier was turning, raising his weapon. George discharged first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots discharged over 3 days. 11 enemy sharpshooters eliminated. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat. They had eliminated 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices. Enemy voices. Coming from the tree line. Multiple soldiers. Moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had eliminated the sharpshooters, but the sharpshooters hadn't been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The enemy voices grew louder. At least 6 soldiers, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 eliminated sharpshooters. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These weren't sharpshooters, infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation. Urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks, bootprints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He hadn't been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 enemy soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action weapon. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed by. Or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, an enemy soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down, directly at George. Their eyes met. George discharged from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged. Chambered another round. Rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George discharged. Worked the bolt. Discharged again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Enemy rifle fire cracked through the vegetation. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were discharging at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He glassed the area through his optic, detected movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, discharged. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The enemy was flanking. 1 group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action weapon against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. George grabbed his weapon and ran north. He sprinted through the vegetation undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Enemy rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The enemy voices were distant now. They hadn't pursued. They were regrouping around their eliminated. George inspected his weapon. Mud on the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The vegetation was quiet. No voices, no movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry let him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 enemy sharpshooters eliminated over 4 days. 12 rounds discharged against the marksman. 11 strikes, then a firefight with infantry. 3 more eliminations. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the weapon. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his weapon and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The enemy was evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. Cosmoline and gun oil, patches run through the barrel until they came out clean. He inspected the scope mountings, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 14 o'clock hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement. Excessive ammunition expenditure. Operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other soldiers to do what he'd done? George said he could try, but it would require time, and weapons with optics, and soldiers who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield weapons with unhurtled scopes, marksman weapons left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 soldiers in the regiment who'd qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a marksman section, train the soldiers, develop tactics, clear any remaining enemy sharpshooters from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield weapons with unhurtled scopes went to the soldiers George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 soldiers assembled at a makeshift range, 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The soldiers were expert marksmen on paper. They'd qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. But none of them had combat experience as sharpshooters. None of them had eliminated a soldier from concealment. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield weapons weighed 11 pounds with the unhurtled scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the weapons stable, but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The vegetation rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Marksmen had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the soldiers shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 soldiers could consistently strike man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets, and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each elimination, the roles could switch. This kept both soldiers proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear enemy positions west of the Matanika River. Intelligence indicated small groups of enemy soldiers were still operating in that area. Not sharpshooters, just infantry, stragglers who hadn't yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the enemy had been using for resupply. At 7:20, an enemy soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George discharged. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more enemy soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 eliminations. 1 missed due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 enemy soldiers eliminated that day. 0 American casualties. The marksman section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had eliminated 74 enemy soldiers. The number was conservative, only counted confirmed eliminations where the body could be observed. The enemy evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the enemy fought effective rearguard actions. George's marksman section was tasked with eliminating enemy soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanaboga River when an enemy rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for medics. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without striking bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover, but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the enemy completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's marksman section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed eliminations, 0 friendly casualties during marksman operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war wasn't finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission, something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan Optic was wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved tropical warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind enemy lines, the kind of mission where a soldier with a weapon that could strike targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new Unit 3,000 soldiers total. The unit had no official designation yet. The soldiers called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307th Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943. But the soldiers had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics, vegetation survival, operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role wasn't officially listed as marksman. The Army didn't have formal marksman positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command understood what George could do with a weapon. Training took place in central India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma terrain would be worse. Steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that understood the ground better than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through vegetation. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification, but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the weapon's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Enemy forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the enemy considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense vegetation, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just weapons and mortar, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous vegetation. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They'd engaged enemy forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders weren't meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines, and create chaos behind enemy positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against an enemy officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a marksman who'd pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 eliminations. George never discharged more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second shot would grant the enemy time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They'd lost more soldiers to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 soldiers was down to fewer than 3,000 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties. Too many sick. Too much time in the vegetation without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the weapon that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped weapon. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less. Firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent weapon, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting weapon ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic weapons like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics, but there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never discharged his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July of 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through tropical terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The weapon had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had eliminated at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The weapon sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned weapons was fading. The military was standardizing, mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale, but something was being lost. The individual's skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the idea that a soldier with the right weapon and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January of 1947. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics, graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the enemy sharpshooters. They didn't know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened, not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of tropical warfare while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical, detailed descriptions of weapons and ammunition and ballistics, not the kind of content that interested general readers. But the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision, no embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what didn't work in combat. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of enemy weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military weapons from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched marksman work become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had eliminated enemy sharpshooters on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting weapon, but it's not. It's the weapon that proved a state champion marksman with a catalog-ordered scope could outshoot professionally trained military sharpshooters. The weapon that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The weapon that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. Remember that question at the beginning? What makes a weapon deadly? The steel? The scope? It was never about the weapon. It was about the soldier behind it. A man they mocked, a weapon they dismissed. 11 enemy sharpshooters eliminated in 4 days. And a legacy that changed military doctrine forever. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Europe? You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These soldiers deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. We'll see you in the next story.